So I'm going to talk as sort of advertise what's youth got to do with it, exploring the travel behavior of millennials. Good, come on down, excellent. And I'm going to structure my talk this afternoon. I'm going to talk a little bit about the motivation. I'm going to talk about the study or the studies that we're engaged in. I'm going to show you some of the results, both related to personal miles traveled, so PMT and commute mode choice. And then I'm going to talk about sort of some implications for the future. And maybe sort of a la the introduction, given the age demographic in this group, we in the questions and answers can do a little ground truthing, I think is what it's, so we can check out to see to what extent some of these themes echo in your own life as travelers. Okay, so let me start with a few things about motivation. I think, how many of you have seen a graph like this somewhere, a newspaper? Okay, so there's a lot of hands. So I'm guessing that that many of you have seen at least some version of this graphic. So this is a graphic of vehicle miles traveled and VMT per capita. And the question inspired by this graph is the popularity of driving waning? So vehicle miles of travel, VMT in the US, peaked in 2007. It's been relatively flat since then. VMT per capita growth began faltering in 2000. So one of the things that gets picked up by the press is that we see this sort of faltering and slow down prior to the recession. So it peaked in 2005, and then it's been gradually declining since then. And then we also know, and I'm going to show you data on this a little bit later, that VMT declines are greater among teens and young adults than among older travelers. So the question, the million-dollar question is, well, is this good news or is it bad news? And so I'm going to come back to this at the very end of my talk, talking about the implications of some of these trends. So is what we're seeing a potentially significant sea change? So if we are headed into a new, greener era where young adults are increasingly dependent on transit, on their feet, on biking, on their mobile devices, and I'll come back to the theme of mobile devices as well, and overall they're less dependent on cars. And then there's the big caveat here that this is happening by choice, that they're choosing to do these things, to travel in these ways. Maybe it's good news. Time to party, celebrate, okay? And particularly, although I think Dowell will quibble with some of these data, particularly because, and this is sort of a graph that I replicated from the Council of Economic Advisors, particularly because millennials are a big group. So we can, sort of talk about their sizes, but they are a big group, and so the idea is they potentially can have, you all can have a large impact. So there's a lot of chatter out there. So where have all the young drivers gone? This first image is the image of a report that just came out in October by US PIRG, talking about some of these trends. But it's joined by all kinds of other advocacy organizations and media outlets that are talking about some of these patterns. So why young Americans are driving so much less than their parents. The real reason kids are driving less. The cheapest generation. Are Americans driving less because they're working less? So you can see, sort of some of the themes, but the thread that ties this all together is this question: where have all the young drivers gone? So the question is this a dawn of a new era of travel? So Time magazine was not talking about travel per se, just talking about youth and millennials, the generation changing the world, right? And so here we're thinking about, well, does this apply to our interest in travel and travel behavior? And it does have huge implications for thinking about public policy and transportation planning, how we answer this sort of question. So there is a literature on this topic, and a growing literature, although I would argue that the literature is relatively sparse. So we see a body of literature on children's travel. So Marlon Barnett has contributed to this literature, among others. There's certainly a substantial literature on teens and driving and safety. So that literature is out there. There is what I would argue sort of a largely descriptive body of research that has developed on the decline of driving among teens and young adults. So that US PIRG report that just came out, I think, would fall into that camp. And then ultimately, this sort of plausible but largely uncontested set of conclusions that come out of these reports. So again, thinking about this sort of advocacy body of literature. So this is from that US PIRG report. Millennials are different from their parents, and those differences aren't going away. After 5 years of economic growth with stagnant driving, it's time for federal and state governments to wake up to growing evidence that millennials don't want to drive as much as their parents did. This change has big implications, and policymakers shouldn't be asleep at the wheel. So directly from that report. So why, and I'm sure you've heard many of these things as well, why are young people traveling less? And this is sort of all in the mix in this body of literature. So there's the economic downturn. So I already talked about that a little bit. There's increasing use of information and communication technologies. There's stricter driver's licensing requirements, and I'll come back to that one. There's higher fuel prices, although as I was driving over here, they were talking about the recent downturn in fuel prices. There's the improved provision of public transit and biking and walking facilities that gets mentioned. There's later transitions into adulthood, which is important to think about. And in the mix also is this idea that somehow there's this cultural turn toward more urban, less car-dependent lifestyles. And I'll talk about this in a minute, but the study subsequent to the one that I'm presenting on is going to focus on that issue. So my daughters would be completely appalled if they knew that I was doing this right now. Okay, so please. One of them is in LA, one of them thankfully is not. So I'm still on this theme of motivation. So part of it is personal in nature, right? So it might be personal for you because you fit that age demographic, right? Personal for me because I have daughters. When we started this project, I had 2 daughters that were in this demographic. And their stories, they're personal. So this is an N size of 2 here, okay? But their stories with respect to driving were completely different. Okay, so the older, you can guess who's older. But the older, my daughter Risa, when we started the project, she was a freshman in college. She did not drive. She walked. She was an active user of public transit. She got a lot. I think her friends were sick of how many rides she bummed off on from them. She would talk about getting a driver's license as, well, yeah, it was, it's on my list of things to do, but, I haven't really gotten around to it. So it was clearly not very high on her list. And on top of it, her grandparents, my parents, actually gave her one of their old cars, an old Honda Accord, when she was 16, and the car sat around. Because she didn't get her driver's license. So that's, sort of profile daughter number 1. Profile daughter number 2, my younger daughter at the time, 15 and a half years old. She was a high school sophomore. And she was banging down the doors of the DMV, you know, as soon as she was eligible to get her learner's permit. She immediately got that learner's permit. She took every opportunity to stay off transit, not walk, not, you know, all of those things, so that she could then drive that vehicle and drive us around. And I would argue, let's kind of loop in that, you know, sort of piece on technology. I would argue that both found being separated from their iPhones for more than a few minutes to be just a terrible hardship. Okay, so they were equally reliant on their iPhone. So a little bit of personal motivation, thinking about these, you know, two daughters, same family, two different relationships with the automobile. So I was saying before the talk, I'd like to say, you know, I'm in planning. I'd like to say we planned to do this body of research, and it was strategic and but initially I was approached by folks at the Federal Highway Administration who were thinking about the future of travel and was asked to do a bit of statistical analysis for them about millennials and travel. At the same time, my colleague Brian Taylor was also interested in the relationship between technology and travel. So we actually joined forces on the first round of research on millennials and travel, and brought with us a whole team of students, doctoral students and master's students who were interested in the topic. Kelsey Ralph, so the third name on there, is writing her dissertation on this topic, and I'll briefly mention some of the work that she's been doing. And the purpose of this analysis was to sort of explore what determines the changes in the travel behavior of youth. And I'll come back to this study in greater detail in a minute. And then we have signed up for a phase 2 of this project, so there's more to come. Federal Highways is really interested in the geographic variation in the travel behavior of millennials as well. So I could easily have presented another slide with the headlines of newspapers talking about how millennials are returning to, you know, downtown areas. They're more urban than they have been in the past and whatnot. So we're focusing on that aspect of the research right now. So I don't have too much to say on that. So you can see on the left are the research questions for phase 2 of this project. Okay. So I'm going to sort of draw a little bit all over the place from that first phase of the project. So the question again was, what determines the sort of changes in the travel behavior of youth or millennials? And we were particularly interested in sort of teasing out some of these effects. So some of the cohort effects, some of the period effects, and the life cycle effects, in order for us to then sort of think about what kind of implications this all has for future travel, which is what Federal Highways is interested in. So I'm certain, because, you know, inspired by Dowell's work, he's done a lot of this work looking at these sort of cohort effects. You might all know this, but with the life cycle, and I'll kind of relate it to travel a little bit, with the life cycle effects, here we're talking about variation across ages due to physiological changes, the accumulation of social experience, and a role or status changes. So you might expect that generations are like previous generations. In terms of period effects, that we're talking about variation over time that affects all age groups simultaneously, often due to shifts in social or cultural or physical environments. The effect may differ according to where people are located in the life cycle. So we might expect, you know, after the period, we might expect a return to sort of pre-period kind of behavior, or perhaps changes persist over time. And then there's the effect of cohorts that reflect the effects of different formative experiences that affect a particular age group. So here, of course, we're talking about millennials. And just like all those clips I showed you, so the idea is that if there's some kind of a cohort effect, the changes may persist into the future. Okay, so back to the travel of millennials. So the question is, how large a role does the sort of cohort or the cohort effect play? And I will admit that we came in with a hypothesis, and the hypothesis is that among youth, the downturn in the economy potentially would have a larger effect on travel behavior than cohort. So we came in thinking that the hypothesis is that we would challenge that prevailing expectation, and you'll see why in a minute when I show you some of the data. So, so an example. That's what's on this slide. So for example, if driving is down, we see a decline in vehicle travel because income and auto ownership are positively related to age. So thinking about life cycle in some way. We would expect as youth age and accumulate more human capital that they would be more likely to drive. And we see certainly evidence of that. If driving is down due primarily to lagging real incomes and persistently high youth unemployment, so perhaps a period effect associated with recession, then we might expect a driving revival when economic boom times eventually return. And then finally, if we see that driving is down because younger travelers are abandoning their suburbs, for example, and they're abandoning their cars for central cities and for more multimodal travel, then we might expect flat or declining motor vehicle use to be a much longer term trend, and we would sort of think about our planning accordingly. So we were interested in all of this in the mix. We were also interested in how many? 1, 2, 3, 4. These 4 other factors that come up in this body of literature. So the employment and the economy, changes in household structure. So the notion of the boomerangers, the reliance on information and communication technologies, and then changes in the regulatory environment related to driver's licensing, which my daughters, going back to my daughters, complain a lot about. So this trend toward graduated driver's licensing. So you can see why we kind of have this hypothesis about the economy. This is just unemployment rates in 2010. And you can see that unemployment rates are high, 2.5 times higher for youth. Youth were very hard hit by the recession and continue to be, and I'll come back to those numbers. As it turns out, trying to estimate who's when we talk about boomerang, I guess that's the nature of those toys, right? It's supposed to be leaving and then coming back, yeah? So these data don't exactly match up with that. So this is from the Pew Research Center. It's on the rising share of young adults living in multi-generational households. So hard to track people if they move out and come back or whatnot. But you can certainly see an uptick in these multi-generational households as well. That's picked up in the literature. There's a lot of books on it, and I really like that image on the cover of the New Yorker. That is a boomeranger coming back and hanging his diploma on the wall of the room in his family house. Okay, so this also comes from the Pew Research Center. So looking at a reliance on technology by age groups. So you can interpret this in a lot of different ways. Certainly there's, over time there's been an uptick in use of technology. So this is the percent within each age group who goes online in general. But at the top of the heap are those that are younger. And then there's really been a tidal wave of change in terms of regulations related to driver's licensing. Okay, so typically, and I'll show you a map of what this looks like in the country, but typically you have a lot of state regulations that are phased like is shown in this graphic. So you have a permit phased where there's some sort of supervised driving. The ages vary depending on the state. Yeah, so 15, 16, 15 and a half here in California. Then there's some kind of an intermediate phase where there are some restrictions. So there might be night and passenger restrictions. So for example, in California, you can't drive with another teenager for a year after you get your driver's license, okay? And then ultimately it's graduated, right? So you move toward your full privileges, and again, it varies by what age that occurs. So we've explored this. I'll talk a little bit about it in terms of our results. We've used the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, so IIHS, came up with a point-based ranking system to kind of rank the stringency of these state regulations and to categorize them into poor, marginal, fair, and good. And it's what we use to characterize the regulatory environment, and you'll see how this plays out. It's used certainly a lot in the safety literature related to teens and crashes. So what they've done is assign points for the number and the stringency of the components in any given state. So for example, a state with night driving restrictions that go into effect before 10 p.m. would earn 2 points, and a state with night driving restrictions that commences after 10 would only get 1 point. So there's a bit of arbitrariness in this. But again, ultimately, they come down to a poor, marginal, and fair and good categories. So here you get a slice of how these regulations have changed over time. So the lighter is, sort of less stringent, sort of weaker regulatory environment, and the whatever color that is, red, I guess, is a much stronger, is good, is a stronger regulatory environment. And you can see pretty clearly which direction we've gone. Largely, again, with the underlying concern related to crashes and safety. And so there is evidence that the stringency of these graduated driver's licensing programs does improve safety, although it's a complicated literature. Okay, so what did we do? So in our first analysis, we used data from 3 of the national travel surveys. So the 1990 National Personal Transportation Survey and the 2001 and 2009 National Household Travel Survey. We did, and I'm going to show you a table, and you'll see the array of analyses that we did. But some of the analysis, we focused specifically on teens. And we did that largely related to the graduated driver's licensing. We focused on young adults. In some of the analysis, we compared the travel behavior to what was going on with adults. In phase 1 of our analysis, we only focused on metro areas. Phase 2, we're going to look at travelers outside of the metro areas as well. And for today, I'm just going to talk about personal miles of travel and commute mode. But we also did some work on trips and number of trips and trip making. And also, we're quite interested in thinking about social trip mode, particularly as it related to technology and reliance on communication technologies. But I'm not going to talk about that. So when I look at this, I'm exhausted already. So these are the different kinds of analyses that we've done and sort of layered on to that. In the second phase of the project, we're going to deal with geography. So we're going to sort of add to this table as well. You won't be tested on this table, I promise you. A lot of the work is based on this sort of fundamental sort of conceptual models that we had. Some travel behavior outcome. We had the variables of interest that I mentioned already, so employment, young adult lives with parents, their use of the web, the licensing regulations, To that, we sort of controlled for and looked at individual characteristics, characteristics of the household, loosely characteristics of the neighborhood in which they live. And again, that's an area that we're expanding on now. And then finally, we were interested in this issue of cohort. So what generation were they? So with respect to the cohort piece of analysis, we used all the sort of 3 cross-sectional data sets of these surveys that I mentioned. And we linked observations across the survey years by the birth decade of the traveler. But keep in mind that the travelers themselves, it's not a longitudinal data set. We're not following individual travelers. Okay, so they're separate panel data sets. And there's certainly some limitations that are associated with doing this. So this, whatever it is, figure or table, gives you an idea of the ages of the birth cohorts that are included in the model by the various survey years. And this, if you're interested in, is just the sample size that we have, also by the generation, so you can give you an idea. So even those born in the 1990s, the sample is the smallest, right, among our different generations, but we still have close to 12,000 individuals in that category. All right, so let me, that was the setup. Let me talk about some of the results. So the first thing, remember when I talked about some of the variables of interest, I really was focused on other people's data, right? What Pew had said about reliance on technology. And so now I'm going to kind of, at least for starters, before I get into the travel piece of it, talk about, well, you know, if we're looking at these 3 travel surveys, do we see similar kinds of trends? So this graph shows employment status from the 3 survey years, so 1990, 2001, and 2009. So you can certainly see the bar in the line in blue is 2009. So you can certainly see among the younger in that group, almost you can certainly see a decline in employment compared to earlier survey years. This is, again, really tough to get at this idea of boomerangers because there's nowhere in the data can you figure out whether someone left and came back, all right? So here is, on this graph, you see the increase in the percentage of young people, so 19 to 26, who are living with their parents. And so, again, using the travel survey data, we see a huge jump from 2001 to 2009. So 58% in 2009, 58% of young folks, 19 to 26, were living with their parents. And we need better data on reliance on technology. There's no question about it. So we were constrained by the data that we had. So the NHTS has the percent that use the web, daily usage of the web, and so that's what we had to work with, and it's certainly a limitation. I'll come back and talk just a little bit about technology in a few minutes, okay? You certainly see a jump for everybody in terms of the percent who use the web, but it is, you know, certainly slightly higher among youth than among older adults. And this is the percent of teens 15 to 18 that are drivers by the licensing regime or the licensing regulations that I talked about. And you can see that there is a negative relationship between the percent of drivers in our sample and the stringency of the driver's licensing regulations. So I'll come back to this point as well. Okay, so what's the story with personal miles traveled? So this is what it looks like for the 3 groups by sort of age, by age groups, and certainly you can see you can see the whole distribution, but youth are traveling fewer miles. So that publicity is true. I mean, they are traveling fewer miles. We did a whole, I mean, that table that I just showed you, we did a lot of different models. This one here, it happens to be the Cohort model, because I was most recently working on that paper, where we combined data from all 3 of the survey years. So again, we had numerous models, and the models took a different form depending on the outcome that we were looking at. So as a reminder, you know, the report, and I'll give you the website for the report. You can take a look at it. The report looked at PMT, TRIPS, mode, and cohort. Again, youth and adults, and with respect to teens, this issue of driver's licensing. And in the most recent body of work, if you happened to be at the Planners Conference last week, Kelsey, who I mentioned is working on this project for her dissertation, was focused on types of youth travelers. And so we've added that layer to the analysis as well. So with respect to the independent effect of birth cohort on personal miles travel, what we found is that there is a cohort effect. I mean, it's a sort of a cautionary tale, and I'll talk about that. But it does look like there's an effect of cohort. So controlling for all those things that were in that conceptual model that I presented, those in the 1990s, in that sort of generation, were traveling about 16% fewer miles, personal miles traveled. Okay? So this says that same thing. So again, some sort of got to be treated with caution just because of the nature of the analysis. So those born in the 1980s experienced 7% less PMT, 16% for the 1990s. Although, and I'll show you in a minute, there are other factors certainly that contributed to changes in PMT as well. So this graph shows is a comparison of the effects on PMT of birth cohorts. So those are in the red bars to some of the other factors. So you can see that being employed, for example, has a huge, as you might expect, it's not that surprising that being employed would have a huge effect on PMT. At the bottom of this graph is using the web daily. And we found that that was associated with more PMT, not less. So what did we find with respect to commute mode? So as you might expect, you know, most youth, like most adults, get around using a vehicle, using a car. They're more likely to carpool, but they're still mostly getting around using an automobile. So one thing to pick up on when you're, you know, sort of hearing the reports about a tidal sea of change in the travel mode of millennials is whether that's a change from 1 to 2%. That's a big change, okay? But ultimately still a small percentage of travel. So just be very clear as you're sort of making your way through the literature on this topic, okay? So in terms of the share of young solo commuters, it's down slightly since 1990, but actually it's up slightly since 2001. So I'm a curious one, and I was interested. So a lot of the data in the NHTS, in the travel surveys, is hard to check with other national data sources because this is the travel survey. This is an extensive travel survey, but Commute Mode is one that you can check. You can check it with the census data. And actually these patterns do hold true for the census data as well. So a slight uptick since 2000, for example. And so this is the exact same data, just a different form, looking at drive alone by age. So we applied a similar model, again, very focused on looking at the likelihood of commuting solo and the impact of cohorts on that. This graph looks very different than the personal miles traveled. So actually, so remember who the sample is. These are already workers, okay, because they're commuting. So with the worker sample, we actually find that youth in more recent generations are more likely to drive alone, to commute by solo driving. Although that bump, that generational bump, has declined over time. And that's what you see on this graph. So, so what are some of the implications? And again, going back to our question and our hypothesis, are the observed trends in millennials travel due to economic or to generational factors? My colleague said yes, as on this similar graphic, but really there is a bit of truth to both. It's a hard story. I think that the press wants the big headline that it's a decline, it's whatever. But really behavior is complicated, and there is some evidence showing that both of these things play a role. So in terms of the generational effects, there's a strong and almost linear negative trend in the relationship between PMT, so personal miles travel, and birth decade from the 1960s to the 1990s, after we control for an array of other factors. There's evidence that young travelers may well be shifting away from the 20th century long trend toward increasing personal travel. It's plausible, we don't know for certain yet, but it is plausible that such generational shifts may persist over time. What's the root of these changes? Well, unfortunately, we're still not certain. We're getting closer, we're circling, but we're still not certain. So in terms of cohort, we can say, well, yeah, there's a cohort effect, but what does this really mean? What's underlying that kind of effect that we see in the graph? And there's some really interesting questions there. Are we talking about habit or the role of previous experience? Are we talking about residential location, which again we're doing some work on? Are we talking about sort of changes in attitude about our concern for the environment? Although Pew says no, that's not the case, but maybe. Is what we're seeing the lingering effects of the recession? So things do look a little bit better, but again, youth are still lagging in the recovery process. So it's possible that we're seeing the lingering effects of the recession. And it could be that what we're seeing is just a delayed transition into adulthood. So what it means to be 30-something today may be very different from what it meant to be 30-something born in the 1950s. So shifts toward increased personal travel and private vehicle use may occur much later than in previous generations. So it may be what we're seeing is just simply a delay. I mentioned our finding, and again, taken with some caution. It would be great to have more study on this, to have better data to measure technology. But in terms of the role of information and communication technology, in all of the models that we've done, when the sort of use of the internet is statistically significant, it is in the positive direction in terms of increasing travel. So the idea that reliance on technology serves as a complement and not a substitute for travel. We're not the only scholars, researchers, to find this. So Pat Mokhtarian has done some work on this. She was at Davis and is now at Georgia Tech. So we're definitely not alone on this finding. So in 2009, our variable daily web use is positively related to personal miles traveled. And tends to be significant in our models. So again, the caveat at the bottom. So let me talk just for a minute about, I think some of it is off the screen, but a little bit about why that might be the case, sort of the role of technology as it relates to travel behavior. So we might have, I have sort of dimension and a mechanism, and then what might be some of the potential implications for thinking about personal travel. So on the dimension side, we might have just-in-time access to people, goods, and services and information that's provided by technology. In terms of the mechanism, it may be easier to find and purchase goods and services online. I certainly use it. One of those services could be transportation services. So a lot of people are working on those new transportation services. And certainly, sort of my kids with the cell phone, as you can communicate with friends and colleagues. Actually, Pew, I think, asks a really interesting question, which is, what percent of you sleep with your cell phone? And I would venture to guess that both my daughters say yes. They actually, have to be in constant communication. Okay, so there's the buying and the information. There's the communicating with friends and colleagues. In terms of personal travel, again, the effects are complicated, which is why it's, I think, hard to interpret a particular variable in a model. So it could be, potentially, it's not what we found, but it could be that it plays a role in reducing travel, okay? And so rather than go to your local bookstore, if it exists anymore, you purchase your books off Amazon, okay? So you substitute a trip from the bookstore to an online purchase. It could be that there's a relationship between to increase travel. So, my daughter said, "Oh, do you know, you gotta help me, do you know who's playing at the, Whiskey A Go-Go or, whatever? I'm gonna go hear a concert on Friday night." Well, they might have had less access to that kind of information before. So it could motivate trip making as well and serve as a complement. It also, we've not looked at this at all, but it also could actually change the kinds of destinations, thinking more broadly about travel. There's the whole social media dimension of all this. So online relationships is important aspects of social life. And the idea is, well, does that again, substitute for travel? You can do it all online. There's the mobile connectivity piece of technology. So you can communicate while on the go. I know I tell my kids this, when I needed to, meet with someone or go out to the movies, it all came back to home, so I could then have a phone conversation with someone to set up my next engagement. And that's not how you all, or I anymore, navigate around cities. So it certainly could potentially change travel behavior. And then there's the geolocation piece of this as well. So all the wayfinding, the maps, the directions, the traffic, all of that. That could certainly play a role in increasing travel. Certainly for seniors, using GPS services have played a role. It can certainly play, it has in my life played a role, all the traffic. I'm kind of obsessed with my Google Maps and traffic, or my car GPS, thinking about change in the time of day or routes or potentially modes of travel as well. So it's complicated. One variable on the use of internet does not say all, so it's a very complicated landscape. Let me talk for just a couple of minutes about the graduated driver's licensing. So in a separate piece of analysis, we've looked at the relationship between the stringency of graduated driver's licensing policies and travel behavior and driving among teens, so taking that younger age group. And it does look like the stringency of those regulations does play a role. So it reduces their likelihood of becoming a driver by about 6 to 11 percentage points and reduces their mobility as well, so their personal miles traveled. The effect is clearly stronger for younger teens than older teens, because remember, the sort of regulations phase out as teenagers get a bit older. And still, while alternative modes of travel remains rare, more stringent graduated driver's licensing policies increase the use of alternative modes of travel. So in addition, this may not be, I'm not saying it's a good thing necessarily, and I'll come back to this, but it certainly has had an effect on younger teens. So the commute, a driving ambition. So back to the findings on commute mode. Millennials are more likely to drive alone to work, not less. And the question is why? So keep in mind, as I mentioned before, we are already talking about commuters. They're employed. And there is a personal travel gulf between employed, better paid, and car-owning young people compared to or underemployed, lower income, and carless individuals as well. So youth unemployment, I just mentioned, is very high. As of July 2014, the unemployment for the US was 6.2%. Youth unemployment rate was over 14%. It's down, so it's headed in the right direction, so down 2 percentage points since the previous year. But still, I said in 2010, 2.5 times, right? It was 2.5 times higher, so now it's still 2.3 times greater than the overall unemployment rate. So for those young travelers who are fortunate enough to be employed, we see, it looks like we see more reliance on driving among those born in more recent generations. So car-loving employed millennials, different kind of story than we've been hearing. It may, there's the out of work story, persistently high unemployment among the young is clearly a serious problem across a whole variety of dimensions. And travel may be one of those that is limiting their access to opportunities. We have this issue of the boomerangers sort of living at home, and we do find that young adults living at home with their parents increase substantially. I showed you the data on that. In our models, that had little effect on personal miles travel, but it was associated with the likelihood of commuting by car. So perhaps gaining access to the parents' vehicles. So what's the bottom line here? So is there a cohort effect? Yes. We still believe that the economy has played a very important role in the travel outcomes that we see. Again, as a reminder, the independent effect of unemployment is associated with 43% fewer sort of PMTs, so personal miles traveled. And the question is, back to what I asked at the beginning of this talk, is this cause for celebration? So we definitely, we're definitely well aware of the negative environmental externalities that are associated with driving, and have a desire to see a turn away from auto dependence towards some kind of more sustainable, more multimodal travel future. However, and this is the caveat, is whether this is good news or bad news, if depressed driving is due mostly to limited auto access and high unemployment, then I would argue, and this is sort of consistent with other work that I've done on travel and poverty, that celebrating declining travel may be premature, and it may certainly be cold-hearted for those with limited opportunities. So thanks. This is the website for the studies if you want to take a look at them. Yeah.
I was wondering if the findings were consistent across race and different ethnicities.
Yeah, so the question for those of you in the back is whether the findings were consistent across race and ethnicity. And we didn't do the analysis separately by race and ethnicity, but we did look at the the contribution of race and ethnicity over time, so it was included in our model. And actually, interestingly enough, we found, and we've not explored this so much, but we actually found waning differences among youth by race and ethnicity over time. So. Now, the relationship between race and ethnicity and reliance on technology, all the variables, we really didn't go down. We were just looking at the outcomes in terms of personal miles travel and commute mode. So there's more work to be done on that front. So, good question. Yeah?
I hope I understood this correctly. So millennials would like to drive alone, but because of the economy, many of them, because they don't have a job, they're not driving as much as they could. Does that mean, if I'm correct in that assumption, does that mean that in the future we could expect a great deal of increase in people who like to drive alone?
So I'm going to be a bit more cautious in how I interpret the results. So millennials who are employed, because remember the outcome was their commute travel, like to do it solo. I mean, I don't know if like. They are more likely to do it by solo driving, right? So you're right. If the economic fortunes of youth improve, we're likely to see more youth. More youth are employed. We're likely to see an uptick in solo commuting. So that piece is true. Although if you remember that graph, and this is where we're not certain where the story ends, the bump in terms of the generational effect has declined over time. So it may be, if you're sort of thinking about the future, it may be we'll get the sort of next version of the National Household Travel Survey, and it may be that there isn't a bump. Maybe the direction is heading into declining use. Right.
If I may just follow up.
Yeah, please.
So what are your personal thoughts in terms of, do you think the millennials are perhaps more environmentally conscious, or are they economically strained? Are they economically constrained?
Oh.
And that is why we're seeing what we're seeing, or is it both?
Yeah. So I'm not certain. There's not a question about environmental consciousness. So really everything I know about environmental consciousness and age comes from Pew. And so there is an expectation, it does show up in the media, that somehow millennials are more concerned about the environment than other age groups. And they have shown that that is not the case. That there is an increase in concern. I mean, people are more concerned about the environment, but millennials are not more concerned about the environment than other. That does not come from our data. We do not. I wish we had a more complex data set that enabled us to look at these things. I think that we cannot, so the second part of your question is I think that we cannot underestimate the impact of the economy and employment, right? So if we just think about travel behavior, it is true that the commute is only a small percentage, right, of travel, because you can think about your own travel. We travel for all kinds of purposes, and the commute is a piece of that. Right, but in terms of how far you travel and when, issues of congestion and whatnot, the commute is an important trip, which is why we studied it. So yeah, I think that the economy and employment plays a very big role. And the last thing, and I didn't present this, but again, one of our students did at the planning conference, is that the story that gets told about millennials is maybe the story of white middle class college educated kids going to live in downtown, working. Let's paint the hope, working for Google and living in San Francisco and taking the Google bus to Mountain View. I mean, that's the kind of story. And is that happening? Yeah, it is. The percent, if we think about all youth, if we're looking at the whole pie, right, it's a very, very small picture. It's not the dominant story. It is the dominant story that gets picked up in the media on millennials and travel.
Do you want to go ahead and elaborate on that? Because I was at that presentation. So the other side of that was the youth who are on the low end.
Yes.
You might want to say a few words about that.
So yeah, so the student, we have the student that is, and this is for the sort of second phase of our project, is we are doing a typology of travelers, so doing a cluster analysis based on travel behavior, a variety of travel outcome measures to look at how youth are traveling. So what are those sort of dominant clusters to get at precisely that sort of image? Is it, do we see the, millennials returning to, central city and whatnot? And so as we might expect, the biggest cluster are youth like everybody else who take almost all of their trips by automobile. Okay, so that's the biggest group. The next largest group, and we just had a hot discussion about what to call this group. So some people want to call it car-free, which makes you feel like you're liberated from the automobile, car-less, or whatever. But the next largest group are a cluster of youth who do not have a car. Originally, the student called it stuck in place because those folks tend to be lower income, taking, actually I think that the median is no trip on the travel day, okay? So those are a group of very disadvantaged travelers. And so going back, and then there's the next category are youth that are multimodal, so they're taking multiple forms of transportation. And then there's the, I forgot, urbanistas, that group. So more on that. So we're experimenting with that, and we're also going to add sort of a bit of the sort of geographic location to those groups of travelers.
Okay, stemming from that, you said earlier that you looked at metro areas for this, but then it was national households?
Yeah, no, so we looked at, yes, so we didn't look at individual metropolitan areas, but everybody in our sample lived in a metropolitan area. So you could see on that schematic, the conceptual schematic, is we did look at, in the sort of first phase of the analysis, we did incorporate things like density, for example, or the size of the metropolitan area. And what we're doing right now is where the federal highways really wanted to look at the whole country because they're interested in what happens outside of metropolitan areas as well. So we're sort of characterizing, we're doing a similar kind of cluster analysis on the neighborhood side to characterize neighborhoods throughout the US, and then we're going to analyze travelers accordingly so we can get at some of those other themes about residential location. Yeah, that survey is intended as a nationally stratified sample, right? So it's kind of intended to be used in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, you talk about millennials are more likely to drive alone, but yet VMT is declining. So what do you explain for that difference?
Yeah. So again, the commute is only part of the story, right? I mean, so the commute is only a piece of the story, and so VMT is all miles traveled. A commute is only a little slice of that. So just keep that in mind. So we also looked at other trips as well. So we looked at social trips as well. But yeah, so those are both plausible stories that you would have a decline in VMT, but still among that subset who are working and millennials, that we see a bump up for travel.
About driving less, you said about economic downturn, more information, price of fuel is increasing, right? I know that they have a big volatility in the fuel price here, but
yeah, we didn't look at fuel is not something we looked at, but yeah.
Do you know about the price of driving? Not only analyzing fuel prices, but car prices, insurance prices, and taxes. If these costs are increasing or decreasing over time?
Yeah, so that was not, so I don't know if everybody heard. So that was not incorporated, that's a great question. It was not incorporated in our analysis. So on one of the slides I talked about, which is true, it gets raised in the discussion about sort of changes in vehicle miles traveled, is the increase in fuel prices, although it has been somewhat volatile, so there's no question about that. And extended on to that question is, what are the other costs of automobile ownership itself? And I don't know exactly, although the price of cars, I think the actual vehicle, sort of the biggest piece of it is the purchase of the vehicle itself. And over time, that price has gone down. But yeah, I don't know how that factors in. I mean, good question.
Excellent presentation.